Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com. Countless scientists, climate experts, and government officials agree that 350 parts per million is the safe level of carbon dioxide. Countless is a lot of experts, and they say that if we can keep carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million, the climate will be safe. Let's go back in time now to 1988, which was the last time carbon dioxide was at a safe level in the atmosphere. During the safe summer of 1988, Yellowstone National Park largely burned up. The Mississippi River also nearly dried up during that safe summer in 1988. And Hurricane Gilbert did massive damage to the Caribbean during September 1988. The New York Times described it as the strongest hurricane to hit the Western Hemisphere during the century. The storm covered almost the entire Gulf of Mexico. I was living in Houston during September 1988, and at one time the storm was forecast to make a direct hit on the city. Houston would have been largely wiped out by this Category 5 hurricane, but fortunately the storm took a track further south. The eye of Hurricane Gilbert was rather spectacular, and it tied with Hurricane Camille as being the second most intense landfalling Atlantic hurricane. This satellite photo was taken around the time when Hurricane Gilbert destroyed the Cancun airport. Hurricane Gilbert also destroyed the coral reefs along the eastern side of the Yucatan Peninsula. Apparently 350 parts per million CO2 wasn't so safe for coral reefs. Note that the three most intense Atlantic hurricanes occurred in 1935, 1969, and 1988, all with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million. So perhaps 350 parts per million isn't actually the safe level of CO2. Maybe we need to go down to 320 parts per million like in 1970. Let's take a look now at how safe the climate was when CO2 was at 320 parts per million. In 1970, the Bola cyclone struck what is now Bangladesh and killed about 500,000 people. It was the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded. The 1970s had some pretty impressive climate disasters. In 1974, about 15% of Australia burned. The 1974 fires burned about 10 times as much acreage as last year's fires in Australia, which were widely misrepresented by the press as being the largest on record. Also in 1974, on Christmas Day, Darwin, Australia was largely destroyed by Cyclone Tracy. 90% of the houses in Darwin were wrecked, and the city had to be evacuated for about a year while it was being rebuilt. During January of 1974, Brisbane received 32 inches of rain, and they had some of their worst flooding on record. During April of 1974, the United States experienced the worst tornado outbreak on record, with 148 tornadoes in 24 hours. 1974 was my freshman year at Arizona State University, and Phoenix had their all-time record heat wave, with 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees. 1974 was also the peak year of the 1970s Ice Age scare. Time magazine said that the weather during the 1970s was bizarre and unpredictable. They said we were headed into another ice age, and telltale signs were everywhere. Science News ran this cover on March 1, 1975. The Ice Age cometh. They visualized glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. Climatologists wanted to stop global cooling by melting the Arctic ice cap. And the climate alarmist Guardian reported on January 29, 1974, space satellites show new ice age coming fast. During the 1970s, carbon dioxide levels were between 320 and 330 parts per million. There were all kinds of weather disasters occurring, and climatologists blamed the bad weather on global cooling and a coming ice age. In 1974, Newsweek warned us about the cooling world and wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap. But 14 years later, during the very hot summer of 1988, they warned us about the greenhouse effect, and they said, danger, more hot summers ahead. But they had it exactly backwards. It turned out that 1988 was actually the last really hot summer in the United States, and that all of our hottest summers occurred when carbon dioxide was below 350 parts per million. As carbon dioxide levels have increased in the atmosphere, the frequency of hot days in the United States has decreased. This belief system that the climate was safe below 350 parts per million is not based on science, history, or any rational thinking. The belief system is based on some misinformation which NASA's James Hansen told Congress in June 1988. Hansen warned Congress about heat, drought, and massive hurricanes. But the reality is that the U.S. government has known since before Joe Biden was born that global warming alarmism is based on nonsense. In 1941, the Department of Agriculture published this booklet, Climate and Man. They said, much has been written about varying amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a possible cause of glacial periods. The theory received a fatal blow when it was realized that carbon dioxide is very selective as to the wavelengths of radiant energy it will absorb, filtering out only such waves as even very minute quantities of water vapor dispose of anyway. No probable increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide could materially affect either the amount of insulation reaching the surface or the amount of terrestrial radiation lost to space. 80 years ago, the U.S. government knew that the idea of catastrophic global warming had no basis in science. And yet government policy in the year 2021 is based around irrational climate hysteria.
But kiddo, I want you to just take a look, okay? You don't have to agree. But I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate. Okay?
In President Biden's National Day of Prayer, he mentioned climate change, but he did not mention God. That's because climate change is in itself a religion. G.K. Chesterton said, "When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything." And Joe Biden is living proof of what he said. Biden isn't very bright, but fortunately Toto is. Toto knows that the climate wasn't safe even prior to 1940. In another video, he will highlight the unsafe climate below 320 parts per million. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on junk science for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.